Welcome to the Gottesdienst Crowd, where we foster confessional integrity, liturgical preservation, and preaching that doesn't stink. We believe that the historic liturgy of the divine service is more than mere cobwebs of antiquity, but it is a true treasure of the Church, to be dusted off and brought down from her attic to be enjoyed. So let's get dusting. Welcome back to the Gottesdienst Crowd. This is Jason Broughton, your host. It's a new year, and we're back with a new set of episodes. And we have with us our fearless editor-in-chief, Fritz Eckardt. He is the pastor of St. Paul's Evangelical Lutheran Church in Kewanee, Illinois. Welcome back, Fritz.
Good to be here. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. So we have gotten a question about the 12 days of Christmas and how the season of Christmas and those 12 days work together with the Feast of Epiphany and then the season of Epiphany. And so what I kind of wanted to discuss today, goodness, you can tell it's been a while, is how can the Church celebrate the 12 days of Christmas? And then how can individuals, perhaps I'll just say, how can fathers begin to celebrate the 12 days of Christmas at home in such a way that it distinguishes the Christian feast of the Nativity of our Lord and that season from the world celebration of December 25th. So let's start with kind of what are the 12 days of Christmas?
Well, I'd start with, I was thinking of that ubiquitous song, The 12 Days of Christmas. And I actually think that's a good starting point. I believe that it's incumbent on pastors to teach their people from the start something that they don't instinctively know, and that is that the 12 days of Christmas begin on Christmas Day. I suspect most people think that that's leading up to Christmas somehow, because that's, of course, the way the world celebrates Christmas. They have all these Christmas songs on the radio, they have all this celebrating and so forth going on during Advent. And I don't want to be too harsh on them for that, because it's good to hear Christmas music at any time in the public square. So I don't want to squash that. At the same time, I think it's important for the Church to maintain the distinction between Advent and Christmas and to resist the temptation to celebrate Christmas early in the Church. Because if we're talking about the home, the emphasis or the emphases in the home have to begin with the Church's clarion call, as it were. And that means we need to resist what some people want, and that is to sing Christmas carols in the church during Advent. And I have a friend who got into one peck of trouble because his parish complained that he didn't let them sing Christmas carols. And it occurred to me later on that what they were complaining about was the fact that he scheduled Advent hymns for Advent. Well, that seems obvious to some of us, but I think that we need to gently explain to our people that there are some really good Advent hymns, and that the season of Advent is a marvelous season in its own right. So I think we need to start there. And as we then emphasize those things about Advent, we are better equipped to celebrate Christmas and Christmastide as Christmastide. And I think that along the same lines, it has always been important to me in scheduling hymns for the church to sing, to have Christmas carols on the list, not only on Christmas Day or Christmas Eve, but during that entire season. So the Sunday after Christmas, the midweek services and so forth, anything that the church schedules on Christmas and after Christmas leading up to Epiphany should include a heavy dose of Christmas carols. And that in itself will be a little bit jarring to some people, especially people who are not accustomed to the way in which the church celebrates the feast. But I think that sends a message that we celebrate Christmas beginning on the first day of Christmas, which is Christmas Day. And then, you can use that song as a kind of a way to explain to people that these are the 12 holy days of celebration. And I call it celebration as opposed to something that has always disturbed me about the Roman Catholic Church, and that is their emphasis on what they call holy days of obligation. I never liked that designation because they say, it starts with a good idea. They say these are the days in which the faithful are obligated to expected to attend worship services, Christmas, Epiphany, and so forth. Well, sure they are. We're always obligated to attend worship, but to make it something that forces people is, I think, a little bit to miss the mark. It's something we need to encourage our people as a good thing to want to do. So we celebrate Christmas on Christmas, and we have people coming to church who perhaps haven't darkened the doors for quite a long time, and we shouldn't chide them for that. We should celebrate that they're here. I think the C&E Christmas, the C&E Christians, as we call them, Christmas and Easter Christians, are something that generally bothers us as pastors, but I think that another way to look at it is to say, well, we're glad they're here at least then, and give them a heavy dose of what the church is all about and the church's celebration when they do come. And maybe I'm an outlier on that, but I think it's important to approach the whole topic from a celebratory point of view. We have come to Christmas, and we are glad that Christmas is here, and it's a time to set sorrow aside, as the hymnist puts it. And when that emphasis becomes apparent in the church's calendar, in the sanctoral cycle of the church, and we set aside the Advent hymns and begin in earnest to sing Christmas carols on Christmas Eve, on Christmas Day, on the Sunday after Christmas, and even perhaps a little bit during Epiphany tide, that then would set the stage for some home emphases, I would think, especially when guided by pastoral counsel with regard to what goes on in the home. There are many ways to celebrate Christmas during Christmastide at home. Our family gets together for all kinds of good times and happy times together as a family. But, sometimes we spend a little time around the piano and we sing some Christmas carols, and we even break into 4-part harmony, just not as a scheduled thing, but as a way of subtly acknowledging that we are in the season of celebration now, beginning on the eve of Christmas. And so I think I'd, in short, start with the church's emphases and cycles and make those something that the people learn overtly from the pastor, rather than something that's assumed, because they don't know this. They don't know what the 12 days of Christmas are. They think they start either before Christmas, or maybe the first day of Christmas is the day after Christmas, or maybe it includes Epiphany. Nope. It's 12 days starting Christmas Day, leading up to and not including Epiphany Day. And I think that that's where we would start.
So you mentioned the sort of secular Christmas song, the 12 Days of Christmas. Does that teach us about what each day is to be focused on, or is that just made up?
Well, as I understand it, those are subtle and secretive ways of emphasizing various Christian things. The partridge in a pear tree is Christ. The second day of Christmas, let's see, what comes second? 2 turtle doves. I think that's the 2 natures of Christ. And you go through every one of those days, and they're supposed to be hidden ways to acknowledge Christian things. And I think that 11th day is 11 apostles before before Judas, or after Judas was killed himself. And I think the 12 drummers drumming are 12 points that are made in the Apostles' Creed. I mean, some of these are pretty obscure, but I do think it is correct to note that the hymn was first put together as a secretive or mysterious way of bringing out or holding fast to various Christian truths. You can look it up on the web. I mean, it's there for the taking.
Your advice is for pastors to begin to teach the faithful that the 12 days of Christmas begins on Christmas Day. What should the church be doing during those 12 days, besides the Sundays after Christmas, in order to help remind the people that this is a high feast day? I mean, a great festival time within the church year.
Well, it's a real challenge, of course, that we don't succeed all the time in meeting, because everybody has Christmas parties during December, and the church is no exception. People have, I mean, we have a Christmas gathering during December before Christmas. People expect that, and that kind of goes hand in hand with the notion that I have that if they're going to be singing Christmas carols at any time, if they're good ones, then I'm not going to quash that. At the same time, I think during the 12 days, there are plenty of opportunities to celebrate. And one of the weird things about the church year at this point is that you have other feast days during the 12 days. You have on the 26th, you have St. Stephen's. On the 27th, you have St. John's. On the 28th, it's the Holy Innocents. And there are other lesser feasts that follow. That makes it a little bit challenging for a pastor to emphasize Christmas at the same time as celebrating those feast days. And I also believe that it's a sort of an interesting quirk in the calendar that if one of those days, the 26th, 27th, or 28th, should fall on a Sunday, it displaces, becomes prominent, becomes celebrated instead of the Sunday after Christmas, even though it's not a first-class feast. So you have, let's say Christmas is on a Saturday. I think next year it'll be on a Friday, or this year, the 2020. So Christmas comes on a Friday this coming year, and that means the 27th, St. John's Day, is going to be on Sunday. Well, under normal circumstances, you would not celebrate a second-class feast over a Sunday. But in the case of the Christmas cycle, you do. So what do? You emphasize, we're going to emphasize St. John, but there has to be at the same time a thread of Christmas in that celebration. It's a challenging thing for pastors because we want to acknowledge these important saints' days, but we also want to acknowledge the importance of the Christmas 12 days. So you kind of do both, I think. I mean, maybe people would disagree with that, but I think there are competing emphases that I think both need to be acknowledged and held up.
Do you have any suggestions in terms of devotional for the home that a father can focus on during those 12 days?
Well, yes. I mean, I do think that Portals of Prayer does this rather well. The book that I wrote some time ago, Every Day Will I Bless Thee, provides this emphasis at home. I'm sure there are other resources that do this well also, especially with the internet. It's an easy thing for fathers or heads of household to find good cause for celebrating at home. And whether it's matins or something even simpler, I think it would be helpful to include the singing of a Christmas carol, and just pick your favorite. I mean, there's all kinds of good ones. In fact, I'll even go out on a limb here as a TLH user and say that one of the areas, I admit, that the Lutheran Service Book is better is that it has better Christmas carols than the Lutheran Hymnal does. There's plenty to choose from. And I think that would be a good thing for a family at home to do, to sing a Christmas carol and have a little home reading every day of the 12 days of Christmas. And then don't stop. I mean, you get to Epiphany and you have a whole season that kind of blends from Christmas into a further celebration of the same idea. Epiphany meaning the manifestation of Christ, which was kind of fluid in the early centuries of the church and kind of has hardened into 2 seasons. But as is the case with virtually every other part of the church year, there's a sort of a blending. The exceptions to that are the Easter the Lenten tide and Easter, but the blending that we see from the last Sundays after Trinity into Advent, and Advent has a nice way of emphasizing the coming of Christ, and then Christ comes, the dual emphases of his second coming and his first coming bleed into Christmas, and then there's the Christmas 12 days, and that bleeds into Epiphany rather nicely. So I have no problem singing Christmas carols into the Epiphany season, especially the octave of Epiphany. I, for one, don't really like pushing Epiphany to a Sunday, although I understand the other point of view that most people won't ever celebrate it then. Well, tough. I mean, there's so many good emphases for Sundays after Christmas and in Epiphany tide that I think one of the things that a pastor can do to train his congregation is to emphasize Epiphany Day. And if people don't come for Epiphany, okay, fine, then you don't get to do Epiphany. But if you have even a handful of people on Epiphany, I think, at least in my opinion, that's something that should be retained. But Epiphany tide is, as I say, a time in which, at least at the outset of it, you can continue to sing some Christmas carols, because there's a nice bleeding of the one celebration into the other, which has always been the case in the early church, in the West and in the East. There's been a sort of a blending of the incarnation and the visit of the wise men and the wedding at Cana and the baptism of our Lord, and all those things make this double season of Christmas and Epiphany a time in which to continue the celebration, and the end of the Advent fast, if you're doing that.
You see this bleeding of Christmas into Epiphany. What distinguishes them?
Well, not a whole lot. I mean, to be brutally honest, I mean, it's, I guess, the emphasis at Christmas is on the incarnation itself, and the emphasis during Epiphany is the various manifestations of this incarnation, not only at the visit of the wise men, the Gentiles coming to the Christ, but his showing forth of his glory at Cana, at the baptism. And I, for one, like the movement that took place of transfiguration to the Epiphany season, from when it used to be celebrated in August, I think, because that's a great manifestation of the glory of Christ. One of the things, by the way, one of the things that I think needs to be mentioned about Christmas, it's a sort of a, I don't know if it's a pet peeve of mine. It's not quite that bad, but I do not like an overemphasis at Christmas on the crucifixion. I mean, I know that he was born for us in order that he might die for us, and his suffering is really the point toward which his incarnation points. But I don't like spending effort. Let me put it this way. I heard a carol that I'd never heard before, probably recently written at a gathering of a public gathering in which a madrigal group was singing. I say something like, "It's not about his birth; it's about the cross. That's what it's about." And this mantra kept repeating, "It's about the cross." We're singing that at Christmas. I mean, that misses something very critical about Christmas. Christmas is not about the cross, ultimately. I mean, of course, there's always a blending there too, but the emphases in the church here are different. Christmas is about the incarnation. And of course, we know that leads to the cross, but let's not replace that emphasis with something that I think sometimes people want to focus on all the time, and that is the cross. I mean, that's obviously a big deal. But we need to spend a good deal of time and emphasis meditating on and focusing on the fact that God became flesh, that he became our brother, and is still and permanently in the flesh. As Dr. Scare once put it, like two rusty iron doors that refuse to be budged coming together. I love that image. The incarnation is itself the fulfillment, the conclusion of man being made in the image of God. And this is something that we can't underemphasize. And I think sometimes zeal to focus on the substitutionary atonement, which of course is critically important, inadvertently gives short shrift to the fact that God and man are become one in the person of Christ. Frankly, it's an emphasis of the Eastern Church, which sometimes gets overdone in the East, but I think it's a good corrective, in a way, to some Western Christians who think so highly and so centrally about the crucifixion that if the flesh of Christ and his divinity separate somehow after that, it's fine with them. The mystery of the incarnation has to be a focus in and of itself. There has to be a distinction in emphasis, in points of emphasis, between Christmas and Holy Week and Easter. I mean, both are critical, but you got to have both. You can't replace one with the other. I'll get off my high horse now because maybe I'm not making sense, but I think that's important.
To go back to the distinction between Christmas and Epiphany, I've always kind of, along the lines of you discussing the distinction that needs to be maintained between Christmas and Lent and Easter, I've always, in my mind's eye, considered Christmas to be a focus on the incarnation with regard to Christ's humility, right? That he humbles himself. Whereas Epiphany sort of focuses on the glorification of this man who is God.
Yes, I follow that. I think that's a good distinction because it's easy to emphasize his humility at Christmas And that is a bridge point, you might say, between Christmas and Lent, especially Passiontide. So it's a really masterful thing that you can do as a pastor when you have laid down the tracks, so to speak, of his humiliation at the point at which he comes out of the womb in such a humble circumstance and humble surrounding. And you've got the holy innocents being slaughtered, and you've got all kinds of difficult things happening surrounding his birth. And then when that track is laid down, so to speak, then you follow that with Epiphany. It's a good opportunity to do some good Christological work with the congregation. I think, I follow what you're saying, and I think you're right.
Yeah, it really does offer you some time to kind of drill into some of the doctrinal emphases within Christology, right? That you can focus on the becoming man, the humiliation of our Lord, even in his birth, the things that he allowed to be done to him and to happen for the purpose of our salvation. That, in other words, our salvation isn't just Good Friday and Easter.
Right.
It's the whole ball of wax, that he lives the perfect life in his humility for us.
Yeah, in fact, I was meditating on something that you just called to mind in preparation for my Epiphany sermon. And that is that you can take the three gifts, the gold, frankincense, and myrrh, I think, and do this emphasis with regard to those three gifts. The gold to emphasize his divinity, perhaps. The frankincense to emphasize his perfect life, his holy, perfect life, and the myrrh to emphasize his death. And so you have some of this overlap. There's always overlap. And when I say emphases need to be acknowledged, I don't mean to say to the exclusion of other points. So I think that, again, the sanctoral cycle, the church year, does this so masterfully that it's right there for us. So during Epiphany Tide, you've already talked about the incarnation, and you just pull that emphasis right along as now you talk about the ways in which Christ, our brother, our humble one, is nevertheless in the flesh, the eternal God, that in him dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily. And he makes water into wine. The heavens open when he's baptized. He shows his glory to his disciples, although at the same time, he warns them not to tell anybody. I mean, these things are just...
Yeah, he calms the storm.
He does all of those things. And they're amazed. And their amazement is a wonderful point of emphasis that we can just bring into our own congregations and families. That amazement is the church's amazement that is constantly before us, that this man who looks very much like us, nevertheless shows himself to be at the same time the eternal God. And his bodily presence then, of course, is what we get in the sacrament. And the sacraments themselves are outgrowths of this dual emphasis of his humiliation and of his glory buried in his flesh, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think you give us a good warning with regard to spending too much time on the crucifixion and resurrection during Christmas. I mean, it sounds so awful for me to say it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I know what you mean.
But I think that's the easy way of explaining and delving into our Lord's humiliation, simply to jump to that specific time of suffering and then that specific time of glorification, as opposed to seeing how his entire life was one of humbling himself for the sake of redeeming us. And that takes a little more time. That takes a little more investigation. That out of Egypt I have called my son. When he goes into Egypt, he must pass by Sinai. He passes by the places where the serpent is raised up. He goes by the place of the first Passover, of which he is the fulfillment. That he is in his very life, right, fulfilling the promises of God. And he humbles himself in order to do that perfectly. Whereas Israel failed, he fulfills
Right.
it.
Yeah. I think that, to get back on the horse I was on a minute ago, to say it's not just about his birth, but it's about the cross. When you're in the midst of celebrating Christmas and Epiphany, is to misunderstand his incarnation altogether, I think. It's not just a mathematical equation. We have sin, so we need a redeemer. So he comes and he does what needs to be done in order for our sin to be covered. And we are therefore brought back up to the point we need to be, so we get to go to heaven. I mean, that is almost offensive, not only to the church, but to God. To say such things is to miss the intention of God from the start, which was to create man in order to join him in an eternal relationship where man is brought up to divinity. And of course, this is exactly what happens when Christ becomes flesh. I just fear that emphasis and that important fact is so easily skirted over. So we celebrate Christmas because Jesus is born. Well, we need to talk about who Jesus is, who is born. He is the creator of his mother. I mean, the angel of the Lord appears to the shepherds to announce the birth of their maker in the flesh. And they go and they see in the cradle, and that goes for the wise men too. They come from far to behold not only their Redeemer, but their Creator. I mean, this is just, and they're overjoyed because they know more than we do. I think, sometimes we just need to be smacked upside the head, frankly. There's nothing in all the world which is more amazing than the fact that God has joined himself to our flesh and so come to redeem us and rescue us from ourselves. If you don't get the first point, you'll never get the second point down. So I promise I won't get back on the high horse again. I've been on it twice now.
Have any final thoughts about celebrating the 12 days of Christmas in the church, in the home, and how that leads into the celebration of Epiphany?
Yeah, I think as you can tell, I am more disturbed about borrowing from Holy Week than I am about borrowing from Christmas when you're in Advent. And what I mean is that I'm not going to get upset about people singing Christmas carols at their Christmas parties before Christmas. You can say, well, the choirs or the people are practicing for Christmas. That's fine. I don't ever get disturbed about hearing in the marketplace, God and sinners reconciled. I don't care what time of the year it is. That's a good thing. But I do not want to give short shrift ever to this marvelous mystery of God and man becoming one in the person of Jesus. Even at the thought that we know why he came, to give his life, but the life that he came to give does not divide him from us. It binds him to us forever. And I think that since we're entering into Epiphany now, it might be a good time to suggest that we adopt the mindset of the Magi, the wise men, who dropped everything. They probably came from Babylon, I'm thinking. And they dropped everything. And they knew what they expected to find. They were not wondering about what that star meant. They knew what they were coming about to find. At least they knew that he was born King of the Jews and he's there somewhere. And we have come to worship him, which means they understood his divinity, at least to some degree. And when they saw the star again, they were overjoyed, which ought to give us further reason ourselves to readjust our thinking about life. This is the heart of life on earth. The fact that our Creator has come to us and bound himself to us and does all that is needful in order for us to remain and to be and remain with him for eternity.
Well, thank you for your time, and thank you for your insight on these things. We wish you all a very happy New Year and a blessed celebration of Epiphany.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.